Thank you all in the audience for joining us today for this week's virtual panel, What do AVs mean for the environment? Like all technologies, AVs will be what we make of them, and we're focusing this month on some of the bigger topics related to implications of AVs. With Earth Day coming up, we wanted to focus today on the role that AVs could play in improving sustainability and what needs to be considered so this technology could represent a positive step forward for the environment. As a reminder, you'll be able to find the full recording of this panel after it ends, as well as our previous virtual panels on our YouTube channel, website at www.pavecampaign.org, or social media at PaveCampaign. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tabitha Coulter, and I'm PAVE's Director of Operations and the moderator for today's panel. We have three great guests today who I'll introduce briefly, and then we'll move straight on to the questions. So first, to give us an industry perspective, we have Dave Rubin, Public Policy Manager at Cruise. Dave, thanks for joining us. And our second panelist representing the nonprofit sector is Nathaniel Horadam, Managing Consultant and Automated Vehicle Specialist at CTE, the Center for Transportation and the Environment. Nathaniel, welcome. And finally, to represent an academic perspective is Nico Larco, Professor at University of Oregon and Director of Urbanism Next. Nico, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you to you three for joining us here at PAVE for this conversation on AV and the environment. I want to start off on a positive note and ask all of you to share your vision of a world in which AVs have had an unambiguously positive impact on the environment. How far away is that vision and what does it look like? Nathaniel, could we start with you? And then we'll get Dave and Nico to chime in too.
Sure, and thanks, Tabitha, and it's great to be here. Look, automated vehicle technologies are ultimately tools, and they are what we make of them. And ultimately, policy constraints are going to come into play. And the more policy steers the technology development in the right direction, or in a socially positive direction, the more we'll get out of it. The less we steer it, or the more we let less good forces steer it, the worse it might get. But from my standpoint, the way automated vehicles create a greater social good is by really stripping away a lot of the operational and capital programming challenges associated with the deployment of more efficient, shared maybe, but really just better transit and micromobility modes, and possibly even light vehicles and delivery as well. And there are a lot of ways in which it can do that. It reduces space constraints. It can also significantly increase the range of vehicles. And we can maybe get into that a little bit here. I don't want to get too bogged down just to start. But really, solving some of these challenges that have plagued the transit industry, have plagued the micromobility industry, and have plagued the freight delivery industries, and create more sustainable modes out of them.
Absolutely. Nico?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. Just to give people an introduction, so I'm at the Urbanism Next Center, which is at the University of Oregon, and we work on the impacts of innovations such as new mobility, AVs, and e-commerce on cities, looking at the impacts not specifically on the technology, but things on like land use, urban design, street design, building design, transportation, and real estate. So that's kind of the perspective we're bringing. The cascading impacts is what we look at. So in terms of like a potential like rosy, fantastic future, I think it is possible. As Nathaniel said, it will take a lot of work on the structuring that to make sure that happens. And I think that's really a combination of public sector and private sector that would have to do that. What does it look like? Probably first is that AVs are primarily being applied to transit, and we really are keeping transit as the backbone of a networked mobility as a service type system with shared data. That'd be fantastic. We figure out how to remove barriers to AV use, so making sure that things like tech access and tech like knowledge, being able to use it, people who are unbanked or economic issues are overcome. Issues outside of the use of travel in the vehicle, but orientation, for instance, things like that. And that AV cars, which is the most of what we end up talking about with AVs, are really only used to fill gaps in the transit system. They're not allowed to dominate, and they're shared wherever possible, which there's a lot of questions about that. It would be great if it helps with a shift towards electrification, and that it can increase accessibility for a lot of people. The main piece of it would be that in all those things that I just talked about are really helping push towards compact development, amenity-rich urban and neighborhood centers, and like equitable access for all.
Great, thank you. And Dave, what about your vision?
Awesome. Thanks, Tabitha. Great to be here today and to speak with you all. So for a little bit of background, I lead policy research for Cruise's government affairs team. For those who are less familiar, Cruise is based in San Francisco. We're developing a fully autonomous, fully electric and shared ride-sharing service that we're looking to launch in the city of San Francisco and then expand quickly beyond that. So I think, you know, the end game that we're all looking to advance towards is a world where autonomous vehicles, especially when deployed electric, can really reset the failures and nascent challenges that the 20th century transportation landscape have presented to us. You know, fundamental to Cruise's mission and vision is not just safer transportation, but cleaner transportation. So we fundamentally believe in a world where everyone should be able to access clean, green miles, regardless of vehicle ownership and access to a charger. And when we talk about AVs, we view them as intrinsically linked with EVs. I think in order to unlock the greatest environmental benefits that this technology presents us, you have to shoehorn both of those concepts together to really generate the greatest impact. You know, when we talk about timelines as well, obviously we're working towards deploying as quickly as possible towards a world where AVs are not only cleaner and more sustainable, but also are able to improve things like accessibility and equity. But Cruise has actually been able to achieve some of this vision today, which we're tremendously excited about. We just reached a milestone last month with our food delivery program in San Francisco that we've had running since April 2020. We've delivered over 1 million meals in support of COVID-19 relief efforts across San Francisco with 2 local nonprofits, the SF Marin Food Bank and SF New Deal. And we've been able to do that with our fully electric fleet being powered with 100% renewable solar. And that's an incredible, powerful impact that we've been able to advance today, even in a pre-commercial state, that I think, to Nathaniel's point, really speaks to the ability to control, manage, and centrally own and operate a fleet, which is truly a differentiator in this space.
Yeah. Thank you, all three of you, for kind of giving us that perspective. And kind of moving on from there, we do know that, you know, every new technology has positive and negative potential, and often kind of the net effect comes down to our use of that technology rather than something intrinsic about that technology itself. You know, presumably this is also true of AVs. So at a big picture level, I'd like to have all of you walk us through the issues where that negative potential might kind of push through. So Nico, could you start us off this time and walk us through some of those major decision points where you see that could take us one way or the other?
Yeah, so kind of contrasting the vision I was putting before, there's definitely areas of concern. So one of the biggest one is that AVs are proliferate for private use, so not transit or other shared modes. So we end up getting a ton of individual vehicles running around this. And for a lot of this, we look at a link between AVs and transportation network companies, so Uber and Lyft. And we see AVs as simply another version of TNCs, right? It's the same model. You call the thing, it shows up, you get in, it takes you somewhere, you get out, and it goes and does something else. With AVs, it's exactly the same model. It's just that you know, either you own it or you don't own it, and there's a driver there or not a driver there, right? So but the model of like using it that way still exists. And if you look at TNCs, you know, there's a huge increase in vehicle miles traveled. There's a huge increase in congestion that we've seen in a number of studies around the country with this. It also at the same time is causing a lot of pressure on transit. So there's been a number of studies that have shown that transit is losing riders to TNCs. And so if we look at an AV future that's really private auto use dominated and not really helping out with transit, well, you're looking at all sorts of issues with congestion, more VMT, you know, all these types of problems. The other big kind of concern, and we just did a report with AARP and RAND Corporation on older adults, and we're doing work right now, older adults and AVs, and we're doing work right now with the Knight Foundation, working with the cities of Pittsburgh, Miami, San Jose, and Detroit on making sure that AVs are deployed in an equitable way. And there's a lot of concerns. There's a lot of reasons to worry about making sure that, you know, is this, again, as I said before, do people have to have tech access and be tech savvy to be able to use these technologies? Will it be affordable? Will it be affordable? Will people who are unbanked be able to use it? What if you have physical or cognitive barriers? Will this help, or will this, how do we make sure that we're dealing with the entire trip, not just the part where I'm in the vehicle, right? Which is the need around all these things. And then the last piece, really environmentally focused, is this question of sprawl. Which I can talk more about if you'd like, but just as we look at AVs, it seems like there's if it's really reducing the friction of travel for certain groups of people, will they be living further and further away from centers? And that will be a huge push towards sprawl, which obviously has all sorts of environmental and equitable kind of questions about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Nathaniel, anything else to kind of add there from your perspective?
Yeah, so I actually kind of disagree with Nico on the sprawl dimension. I don't think that's the biggest risk. I think fundamentally people still want to live around activities, around other people, and even with the rise of telecommuting and whatnot, I don't see AVs driving that vision. My biggest concern is the same as it's been with TNCs, with electrification and with automation. I mean, everyone's seen the graphic of the 4 different panels. One is a bunch of cars on one road, clogged in traffic. One is a bunch of Ubers clogged in traffic. One is a bunch of electric vehicles clogged in traffic, and one's a bunch of AVs clogged in traffic, and it's all the same picture. My problem with AVs, from that standpoint, is that it may reduce the friction such that it takes away the public appetite to implement the policy changes needed to kind of push us toward that more sustainable future. Even electrification, as it gets, even as we go zero emission, it doesn't necessarily take away all the negative externalities of driving. You're still obviously taking up a lot of space that could be, geared toward, whether it's transit or active transportation, healthier, more sustainable living, ultimately fewer emissions from manufacturing, life cycle emissions, et cetera. Pavement has stormwater runoff issues. Pavement has heat island effects. So there's a whole series of climate challenges that come with maintaining roads the way they are. And if AVs take away a lot of the friction from being stuck in traffic and having to deal with being stuck in traffic and finding parking, and people are more content with the status quo, that's a problem. So that's ultimately where I see that, and electrification to a certain degree, electrification of auto mobility being potentially problematic.
Okay. And Dave, I know Nico and Nathaniel kind of covered a lot there. Any a third perspective there on your takeaway?
Sure, and I can make this brief here, Tabitha. I think there's really 3 inflection points. The first is whether or not we as an industry decide to go all electric and to adopt a more sustainable powertrain model. The second is whether or not AVs will be deployed as personally owned, as Nico was talking about, or in a fleet model. And then the third is whether or not those rides are going to be shared, right? And if we're able to capture those 3, from my perspective, absolutely electrifying, absolutely making sure that we operate as a fleet to reduce the appetite for unneeded trips and to reduce VMT that would be added to the system from that sort of reduced friction, reduced barrier of travel. And then the third, making sure that we're absolutely sharing rides, both from a vehicle perspective, but also very deliberately doing ride pooling. That's going to be critical to avoiding what might be the biggest challenges that we see from AV transportation, even if it is electrified, as Nathaniel noted. You have issues of course, congestion, rising VMT. I think the nuance here that sometimes is lost in the conversation is the fact that AV operators, specifically in fleets, have an intrinsic incentive to reduce congestion, both from a cost perspective in terms of idle VMT, but also from a network benefit perspective. Uber and Lyft drivers often don't internalize those costs in the same way that a fleet operator might. And so I think that's a little bit of a nuance here, but happy to dive into that deeper.
That's great, thanks. Actually, I want to go back to Nathaniel and a point that you kind of touched on, which is that AVs are sometimes seen as a technology that will perpetuate the current car culture that we have. Is that an accurate view, or could you explain a little bit how they might fit into a more multimodal agenda to change the way that cities are?
So as I kind of hinted at up front, a lot of what we do at the Center for Transportation and the Environment is drive innovation in medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification. So primarily around transit and medium and heavy duty trucks. And a lot of what we've been working on in the automation space is around automation of battery electric transit buses. So for instance, we're working on a project with New Flyer Robotic Research in the Connecticut Department of Transportation on their CT Fast Track bus rapid transit corridor. And we ultimately see automation providing a significant operational and capital planning benefit to running that kind of service. Being able to run buses at light rail level capacity, because you can platoon buses behind each other and still have a driver in the lead and have a human presence there. Being able to do precision docking at platforms in a way that humans really are not good at doing, even with things like rub rails and other workarounds to aid that stuff. And then also, one of the biggest challenges when you start looking at medium and heavy duty vehicles is drive efficiency becomes so much more important, as you start to go battery electric because of range constraints. The heavier the vehicle, the more drive efficiency is going to impact the range of that vehicle in one direction or another. So, bus drivers and truck drivers, they all have CDL licenses, they all have CDLs, but there's a big difference between a 6-month driver and a 6-year driver. There's a ton of turnover in these industries. So you see this huge variation in driver skill and therefore vehicle range based on who's driving that vehicle. So when you're procuring a battery electric bus or a battery electric truck, as we're going to start seeing more and more of, the nameplate capacity on a bus or a truck may be 400 kilowatt hours. And, that may give you 200 miles of range or something like that. But if a driver is 20% less efficient, then you're all of a sudden losing, 40 miles of range on a vehicle, which, all of a sudden means that the fleet that procured those vehicles can't transition as quickly as they had thought they would, because they have to plan for worst case scenarios. So automation can kind of standardize a lot of that drive cycle, take away the aggressive acceleration and braking, and make it easier for fleets to plan around this stuff. And that's another thing we're looking at up in Connecticut.
That's great. And turning back to you, Nico, will it be in general easier, harder, or the same to regulate the environmental impact of AVs versus traditional human-driven cars? Will that answer be different at the city and local level versus the federal?
Happy to say, I hope at some point we can talk about the sprawl thing, because I think environmental-wise that there's a lot of implications there, but yeah, we can get to that. But first, I'd say, is it harder, easier, the same? Well, we haven't done a great job with cars to start out with. We're still climbing out of problems with equity, health, the environment that are caused by cars. So I wouldn't say that we should look at what we've done so far as like a great model. And then, will it be easier or harder than that? I think a lot of it depends. It could be harder. One of the issues, so something to think about is I've mentioned the things that we look at, is that it's not just a transportation issue, right? There's going to have all these cascading impacts for all of these different parts of our society. And so when we think about regulating, it's not just thinking about we need to regulate transportation. We need to make sure that the impacts to cities broadly, to communities broadly, are being thought of. So thinking about sprawl and equity, safety, all these different pieces are kind of working together. Things that can make it harder is there are still lots of unknowns, right? And you can see this all over the place. Regulators at the local, state, and national level really are often a little bit in the dark about what the ramifications are and what they're agreeing to. So for instance, in Pennsylvania, they, it was 6 months ago, something like that, they passed a law that made personal delivery devices, so like little bots that deliver your Chipotle or something like that, right? They made those legally pedestrians, and those can weigh up to 500 pounds and go 12 miles per hour. And they preempted local jurisdictions from regulating those things, right? And so you think about that, that is just ripe to create all sorts of problems in cities, and yet we're kind of running really quickly through these things. So things are happening quickly, and I would say that there's too much of a push towards deployment without understanding ramifications. I understand, like, yes, let's get things out. I'm completely sympathetic to companies want to like test things out and make them work, but I also think we can't have things be deployed in a way that ends up causing all sorts of problems. I point to like the US DOT's AV comprehensive plan that came out the last day that Elaine Chao was in the last administration, and that is 100% focused on deployment. And the analogy I often use is it's like getting your 5-year-old to like teaching them how to ride a bike, right? And you're just like getting like 15 minutes later, like they're just starting to get it, and you're like, great, here's the motorcycle, right? Like rushing into this is probably not a good idea. So making sure that we take our time, and then yeah, there are parts that could actually make regulating easier, and they could be really good leverage points, which the biggest one is if data is made available and we can figure out how we can tweak the deployment to make sure that it fits with community goals. And also that, potentially as Dave was saying, if we really go towards fleet, it's going to be a few large parties that are going to be running these more or less most of our transportation, which actually lets you, on the one hand, you have a monopoly kind of issue you have to deal with, and lobbying power, which you have to worry about. But on the other hand, there's the opportunity to implement change really quickly if you can get on the same page.
Great. All right, we'll get to the sprawl and urban design question since it keeps coming up. Dave, I'll turn it to you and start. I would love to hear your perspective, as Cruise is one of many kind of AV developers in this space, and you guys work specifically in San Francisco, as you were mentioning. Could you talk to us a little bit about like that, how your AVs interact with the urban design that already exists in San Francisco, and what you see happening there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think naturally builds on what Nico was talking about. So there's, when we think about the environment, I think there's a lot of opportunity that we have to sort of build and amplify the impact and benefits of our fleet, both from sort of a network operations perspective, but also from the AV tech itself, especially when you look at the unique geography of a place like San Francisco, right? The first is, I think, something that Nico touched on just at the end there, which is the fact that as a fleet, you can make, company-wide decisions with basically the flip of a switch, right? As I noted, Cruise committed to go 100% renewable in California in April of last year, which we're tremendously excited about. There's also, really interesting opportunities that I think exist out there when we think about electrified AVs from a fleet perspective, especially as it relates to things like strategic, like managed charging, right? Where you could have an entire fleet of vehicles working in concert with the grid to plug in at strategic times, take advantage of excess renewable generation, sort of reduce the overall emissions of the state in that way, and even potentially in a future state serve as, even a virtual power plant, right? Being able to help out in communities when there's public safety power shutoffs. Obviously, we have a very California-focused view on this, but you can imagine a whole slew of community support and disaster response roles for AV fleets in the future when they're electric, certainly farther down the road. And then there are sort of those AV-specific technology impacts. We see this all the time in San Francisco. It's been a tremendously rewarding place for us to drive and learn. When we think about how to make the most out of the ADS, the autonomous driving system, to reduce our energy use, obviously, as we all know, San Francisco is an incredibly hilly city. When you're managing a fleet, you have the opportunity to avoid certain topographies or geographies that might increase your energy draw. When you have a good sense of what traffic looks like from a network perspective, you can avoid certain areas that are congested. And even down the road, you could even think of a scenario where when we're deployed and providing service to the public, you could drive more slowly through certain neighborhoods to not only increase safety when you don't have passengers in the car and when you do, but also to reduce energy use. And I think these are all, a suite of potential solutions that we can look to that are obviously geography specific, but also I think, together in a whole sum provide a great opportunity to start to reduce the carbon footprint and net environmental impact of autonomous vehicles when deployed.
Tabitha, can I jump in here real quick?
Yeah.
Because Dave touched on something that I think it's overlooked a lot in terms of the fleet charging side of things. We're not necessarily doing this in Connecticut, but this has been at the front of my mind a lot recently because of the whole controversy over the U.S. Postal Service, going electric, and everyone's like, well, let's just electrify them all tomorrow. Why are we bothering buying more, CNG vehicles or fossil fuel vehicles? And one of the things we do at CTE is support a lot of fleet deployments of battery electric and hydrogen buses and trucks. And so we've seen a lot of those charge management problems firsthand. And if you're trying to go up, scaling like this with a USPS or a UPS or an Amazon type fleet or a bus fleet or any sort of trucking fleet, managing all that charging infrastructure, managing that footprint becomes really challenging. Even with super fast charging, it still takes longer to charge than it will to just plug in your vehicle, but also it creates new opportunities for fueling with super fast charging, whether it's overhead conductive through a pantograph system or inductive, wireless charging. Automation can help align those things without the need for personnel to be on site to manage this stuff and keep your footprint in a depot as small as possible, and also help the utility manage the distribution of power to fewer assets. Because putting all this charging infrastructure in place is going to require a substantial footprint, and especially in urban locations where real estate is a premium, being able to, whether it's, spacing, charging equipment closer together, or even parking vehicles closer together, or parking vehicles closer together while you still have to retain a fleet of spare vehicles because maybe those battery vehicles can't do the duty cycle every single day when it's really cold out or really hot out and the AC is blasting. Those sorts of situations really start to factor in. And I think automation can work with those space constraints in a way that isn't fully appreciated right now.
And Nico, I want to open it back up to you to talk about sprawl and how AVs might impact urban development patterns.
All right, I'll try to do this quickly because I know we're nearing the end of the time. So first of all, historically, we have the layout, the footprint of cities has always been completely tied to transportation, right? So the size of cities, mostly, based on could you walk? Is there a horse? All street cars, trains, cars, right? The expanded footprints. And when we look at AVs, the big things you get is in the US, the average commute time is about 26 minutes. With AVs, you get two things that happen. One is that in 26 minutes, you could potentially go much further because especially along in freeways and arterials, I think they'll be more efficient, especially along freeways. The second piece is that you might take, instead of 26 minutes where you're like kind of staring at the road and a little bit like frustrated and like having to, if you have an AV and you can be doing anything you'd like, sleeping some more, doing some work, eating, watching a movie, you might say, well, maybe I'll do half an hour or 35 minutes, or maybe even 40 minutes is okay for me. I think there's a limit because in the end, we do like to spend time outside of our cars, right? But maybe you do a little bit more. So what that does is that it creates the ability to more easily move further away from the city. So if people are interested in cheaper land, which typically happens further away to get from the city, or being out in natural areas, which typically happens, there's a tremendous pressure for people to continue to move out. I do think there's a limitation, right? People don't like to be in their cars all the time, but it will have this pressure on sprawl. Can you control that? Absolutely, right? So, VMT type fees, all the smart growth kind of regulations and mechanisms that we have to make sure that we don't continue to sprawl out endlessly are important. But I do believe that AVs, like one of the biggest environmental questions, are going to be its potential impact on metropolitan footprint, sprawl, and land consumption.
Absolutely. And I'd love to squeeze in one last question. I think the audience probably got a sense from the description. It's a very unknown kind of topic, and there's lots of different ways that it could result and things that could happen. So I would love to hear from each of you, if you could list just a couple of resources where you might point audience members or people who are wanting to learn more about this subject of the environment and AVs, like where would you push them for? Dave, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. At the risk of sounding incredibly self-promotional, we actually have a very informative Medium page for Cruise that I would definitely encourage the audience to check out. There is some great resources on there about not only our commitment to a fully electric fleet, but also the work that we're doing on the renewable side, including through the low carbon fuel standard, and also some of the more technical things that we're doing to really increase the longevity of our batteries that can, over the long-term impact of our fleet, reduce our footprint as well. So thanks for the event today, Tabitha. It was great.
Great, thank you. And Nathaniel?
So from a transit perspective, FTA published the Strategic Transit Automation Research Plan a few years ago that looked at all these topics. And I don't think it's a comprehensive list. I think there are things that have cropped up, and it wasn't necessarily geared toward electrification, but it was looking at all of these pain points in transit, capital planning and operations that automation can address. And so I would highly recommend looking at that. I'm just going to give one, but yeah, that's a good one.
Great, thank you. And Nico?
The Transit NAV report I just put online there. The thing, and again, the risk of being a little bit self-promotional along with Dave. So Urbanism Next, it's what we do. A lot of this is like trying to inform people about these topics. So if you go to urbanismnext.org, there's a tremendous amount of information, both our own research, but then also other research. And we've developed something called the Nexus, which is a top kind of resource for people to understand everything from what technologies are, the implications, the kind of a framework that organizes all these things, and then what it is that you can be doing to help both on the design and governance side of this to make sure that we get towards positive outcomes.
Thank you all for that, and thanks for sticking with me to squeeze that in. Nathaniel, Dave, Nico, thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon for this fascinating topic. It was a true pleasure.
Thank you.
Tabitha.
Great.
And huge thank you to our live audience and those of you who submitted questions in advance. I think the panelists are dropping some information in the chat, but if you'd like to follow up with PAVE or one of them on this topic, you can also reach out to us on our website contact form or just reply to your registration email and we'll take care of it. As a reminder, we will post the full video recording on our YouTube channel and website later this afternoon. So follow us on any social media at PAVE Campaign to see that as soon as it's out. And final, my self-promotion, don't forget to join us next Wednesday for our next PAVE panel, What Do AVs Mean for the Workforce? Registration is now available at our website at pavecampaign.org/events. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.